Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, class, and whenever you're watching this. Another little mini lecture from me, Professor McQueen, to you to look at sociology and the world around us. Today, we're going to have an interesting topic, as you can probably see from the PowerPoint. Grass, class, and that one locked courtyard you can see but can't touch. A tech and society mini lecture. So, all right, here's a weird but important question. Why do we value grass so much? Like it's just a plant. It doesn't feed us, it doesn't provide shade, and it guzzles water like a teenager after a soccer practice. And yet, in much of the Western world, we've treated it like a moral good. This mini lecture will explore how grass, a literal weed, became a powerful symbol of non-material status and was embedded into our built environments, our neighborhoods, our cities, even our public policies. Drawing on theorists like Bourdieu, Foucault, Weiner, and Marx, we'll look at some things seemingly simple as a lawn and how the connections of systems of power, surveillance, urban exclusion, and even racialized environmental inequality. Because in the end, it's not just about lawns, it's about who gets to have them, show them, and keep others off them. So let's jump into it, shall we? Why grass? Why is it a moral good? And so on and so forth, right? Grass as class, the Bourdieu starter pack. So let's start with Pierre Bourdieu, the king of symbolic power and taste hierarchies. In his framework, grass isn't just grass, it's a cultural capital embedded in everyday life. To have a manufactured or manicured lawn doesn't just mean you own property, it signals that you know how to properly own property. You've absorbed the aesthetic codes of dominant class, and you can perform them convincingly. A pristine lawn becomes a performance of discipline, restraint, and affluence, as well as an extension of what Bourdieu calls habitus, the internalized social knowledge that tells us how to act right in certain spaces without having to be told explicitly. Here's where things get a little wild for your front yard in the technicality or technically private property. But it doesn't function that way. Hear me out. Its an entire value is based on how it looks to other people. Think of it as kind of a public facing private space. You own it, but the social meaning of it is activated only when others see it. A lush green lawn doesn't feed your family, it feeds your social status. Aesthetically, it says, I don't need this land for labor or survival. I have enough economic capital to use it for leisure and show. And this is where Bourdieu meets Veblen. The lawn becomes a form of a conspicuous leisure, a visible indicator that you don't need to hustle. You just curate. The kicker? This has real consequences. In many suburban spaces, especially those with homeowners associations, grass isn't just encouraged, it's enforced. HOAs by bylaws sometimes often require specific grass types, mowing frequencies, and even the shade of green. Why? Not because grass grows well, in many climates it doesn't, but because lawns are coded as moral. The good homeowner maintains a tidy lawn. They discipline the land, just like they discipline themselves, their kids, and implicitly, their neighbors. Deviate from this aesthetic, swap your lawn for a drought-resistant plants, vegetable garden, or anything that reads as a quote-unquote alternative, and suddenly you're deviant. You're just one step with the aesthetic norm. You're just out of step with the aesthetic norm. My apologies. You're violating the neighborhood moral code. You're making non-conforming choices in a space, but on visual conformity. It's not just about that taste. It's about legibility, right? You have to be able to be seen as a middle class, stable, and respectable from the sidewalk, of course. And that's where Foucault sneaks in with a smirk. Because this lawn's obsession, it's not just style, it's surveillance mechanisms. You can't hide behind your front yard. It exposes you. Not mowing your lawn doesn't mean you're busy, it means you're lazy, messy, maybe even unsafe. It raises suspicion if you think of the idea of broken window theory as well. You might get a notice, right? You might get a visit. The lawn becomes a disciplinary tool, a visual form of social sorting that maintains class boundaries. So what looks like a patch of decorative grass is actually a patch of enforced ideology, neat, green, orderly, and deeply political. So when we're in this kind of grass as a class, the Bourdieu starter pack, as we just talked about, and the Foucauldian lens, feel free to pause and read these if you'd like, right? We see this kind of control that becomes determinative, right? And this is where it becomes very interesting, right? That Foucauldian concept of fences and locked green spaces, we now hop on, let's say we hop on a plane quickly and go to London, charming courtyards, lush green squares. And fences, always fences. You'll find these beautiful pocket greeneries all across cities, but unless you have the right keys, leases, or lineage, they're locked. You can see the grass, the trimmed hedges, the shaded benches, but you can't step foot in them. They're not public, they're selectively visible. Michel Foucault would absolutely feast on this. These spaces are textbook examples of what Foucault called disciplined visibility. The power isn't just in keeping people out, it's in making them see what they're excluded from. These parks perform the logic of surveillance and social control through landscaping. You're not invisible in these spaces, you're hypervisible as someone who doesn't belong. The fence doesn't just divide space, it organizes bodies, behaviors, and possibilities. The message? This resource is real, beautiful, nearby, but it's not for you. This isn't just a quirk of London architecture. This logic flows into American city planning. Think about where green spaces exist in your city. Urban planners, often under pressure from developers and political stakeholders, funnel resources into wealthy, more commonly white, neighborhoods with tree-lined streets, playgrounds, and walkable shade. Meanwhile, low-income communities, often predominantly Black, brown, or immigrant, are left with cracked sidewalks, minimal trees, and brutal heat of concrete, heat islands. Here's where we can bring in concepts by Langdon Weiner. Weiner reminds us in this Tech and Society class, artifacts have politics, right? And those parks, fences, even tree canopies, they're not neutral. They encode values about who gets comfort, beauty, and rest, and who gets environmental fatigue, overheating, or disrepair. David Harvey would call this accumulation by dispossession, a process where public wealth, like green spaces, is turned into privatized advantage, often by displacing, excluding others. Neil Smith adds that the idea of the ravenous city, right, the Rianesque city, a city that punishes the poor by taking back space, comfort, and dignity under the guise of beautification and order. Let's also not forget about the visibility itself is a mechanism of power. As Foucault argued, people behave differently when they know they're being watched. And you can know this as well by Thomas' theorem, right? If you think back to your Social 101. And in cities, the surveillance isn't always cameras. It's aesthetic, locked green spaces that says, don't touch, HOA lawns that whisper, be good, a lack of foliage that shouts, you don't matter, right? So, no, that little gated park in Kensington isn't just a garden. It's a material expression of symbolic violence, aesthetic apartheid wrapped in ivy. And we've imported that ideology to the very bones of even American cities. And this is where, as you can see on the slide deck in front of you, I've had it up for a while, these other conversations of Foucault with the idea of disciplined visibility, parks visibility but inaccessible, green space equals class marker, and artifacts of politics. But let's go into a little bit more Arizonian structures, since we're here in this class at ASU. Here's where Karl Marx, right? Tree equity, xeriscaping, and racialized landscapes. But here's where Karl Marx and our Tech and Society syllabus pull up to your driveway and start asking questions about your irrigation bill. Marx's core insights was to follow the material. Who does the labor? Who owns the means of production and who benefits? Applied to your front yard, this means we shouldn't just look at who has trees or grass. We should look at who gets trees, who maintains them, and what greenery is really doing for them. If you understand Tree Equity Score, which is a really cool website to see your localized area, feel free to look it up. We enter in this conversation, a concept of tree equity. We explored earlier in this semester in one of my lectures, discussions on urban heat and racialized infrastructural design. Data from dozens of US cities confirms this. Wider, wealthier neighborhoods have dramatically more trees, while communities of color are often left with the least shade, the highest surface temperatures, and the worst long-term health impacts. This isn't coincidental, right? This isn't a coincidence. City planners invest where political power and capital already exist. And let's be clear, trees aren't just pretty. They reduce cooling costs, increase property values, and provide literal breathability. So the foliage gap isn't just landscaping issues. It's a class gap, a race gap, and a public health crisis all rolled into one. So now zoom back into the idea of what I said before, Arizona. We live in a desert. Grass doesn't belong here. It requires massive water input, chemical treatments, and maintenance schedules, none of which make sense ecologically. But still, we see it in the upper class neighborhoods, golf courses, and luxury developments. Why? Because it's a Midwestern lawn aesthetic. Was imported as a status symbol. The lawn says, I can afford to dominate nature. Meanwhile, working class and middle class homeowners are nudged or mandated into xeriscaping. Native desert plants, gravel, cacti, functional, efficient, smart, but also in the eyes of the dominant taste cultures, a little too dry. Xeriscaping doesn't signal status the same way. In fact, it often reads as cheap or neglected, if not manicured to a high degree, despite being the more ethical or ecological sound choice. My brother lives in Missouri, or did before, and I remember when he visited my parents out here, they live near Cave Creek, all he talked about was like all of this rugged ground because they use a very um, matching the environment neighborhood where my parents are. When really that was a really nice and beautiful and highly chosen selection. He was looking for grass. He was looking for something that mattered to him as a status symbol, back to Veblen, right? That conspicuous leisure, conspicuous consumption. And this is classic Marxian contradiction, right? The people most impacted by ecological degradation, heat, water scarcity, climate volatility, are the ones least able to access the prestige symbols associated with good landscaping. And the symbols themselves are wasteful. The systems reward environmental harm, penalizes sustainability because the aesthetic codes were written by and for people not living in the desert. Even the choice to go full xeriscape doesn't free you from the politics of space. Your gravel and cactus front yard might be responsible, regionally appropriate, but it also signals that you aren't part of the dominant aesthetic class. In other words, even your rocks are being judged. And even that can shift as we construct the concept here. Plenty of upper scale neighborhoods have done some different types, but these plants don't come cheap, right? You want a really nice selection of cacti from cacti farms, you're going to have to pay hand over fist, not just what you can find. So when we talk about landscaping, we're really talking about layered systems of cultural domination, how aesthetics uphold inequality, how environmental responsibility gets coded as lesser, and how built environments reinforce the material logic of capital. It's not just what your yard looks like, it's who your yard performs for and what social story it tells the neighborhood, the HOA, and the city, right? So when we look at this, as talked about, it's not just grass until it's not, right? Tree canopy differences in zip codes, if you look at how they're comparative. Lawn equals a symbolic structure of power. Bourdieu, Foucault, Weiner, Marx frameworks. Landscaping reflects deeper inequality. Root systems equals social systems. And this is where we also get into this concept of grass is class warfare. Change my mind, right? So what does it mean? What does it all mean? The grand question, what does it all mean? Grass seems harmless, even boring, just a green patch we walk over, or water without thinking. But it's actually a microcosm of how aesthetics, power, technology, and space work together to shape society. The lawn is not neutral, it's ideological. Lawn represents symbolic capital if we look to Bourdieu, signaling taste, respectability, and class performance through their appearance. Their visibility acts as a disciplinary mechanism if we think of Michel Foucault, producing social pressure to conform in surveillance and surveilling deviance through aesthetic. Their design and access are shaped by politics. Think of Langdon Weiner, reinforcing who belongs and who doesn't through gates, grids, and green zones. Their labors their labor and upkeep reproduce inequalities, right? And also even divides upon who we view as the ones keeping it, right? So we can look to Marxian theory, with invisible workers maintaining landscapes for the benefits of those at the top, economically, racially, and environmentally. From HOA manicured front lawns to Phoenix to the fenced courtyards of London, from tree equity disparities to the class-coded tensions between xeriscaping and Midwestern grass aesthetics. We can see the same thing over and over. Landscape as a social structure. Grass is where ideology gets moved into the land. So next time someone grumbles at their neighbor's overgrown yard or produces gushes about their green lawn in the middle of the desert, pause for a second. You're not just looking at landscaping. You're looking at embedded status symbols, historical sediment, ecological contradiction, and structural inequality. Root systems, they are included, right? And and as every good theorist knows, what lies beneath is usually the real story. So what does it all mean when you think of this? We think about how we are able to take something as interesting as the lawns that we're looking at and apply even things like these types of conversations into tech and society from the world that's around us, right? From the suburbanized Arizona to the fenced gardens in Kensington. We're not just looking at landscaping. We're looking at historical power. We're looking at zoning, race and water access, colonial aesthetics, and performance of civility. In short, we're looking at the social artifacts that discipline space, taste, and identity. So make sure the next time someone says the grass is greener on the other side, remember to tell them, it's not greener, it's just more prestigious, and probably maintained by someone paid minimum wage under the table. Because at the end of the day, grass is not about the ground, it's about the grid. And in that grid, the lawn is both symbol and symptom of the larger system that tells us who gets to belong and who stays fenced out. And something to also think about as we're coming to the close of this little short lecture is this. You should take a look on Google or use whatever you'd like to look it up of when we stopped having public pools. It was right around the time of removing segregation, because access to resources has always and maintains to be something that we use for class warfare. I'll see you in the next lecture, though.